Today we're taking a hard look at the Zodiac Killer case. What's actually been proven, what's been solved, what's still a mystery after 55 years, and why so much of what gets repeated about this case online doesn't hold up. We'll cover the confirmed attacks, the ciphers, the suspects, and the questions nobody has ever answered. Before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from and what time it is right now where you are. Alright, let's get into it. On the evening of December 5th, 2020, a software developer emailed the FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit with a solution to one of the longest-running unsolved problems in American cryptography. The cipher he submitted had sat in police files, newspaper archives, and the personal collections of obsessive amateur codebreakers for 51 years. It had outlived the detectives who first investigated it, most of the witnesses, and entire careers built around trying to crack it. Within days, the FBI confirmed that he and two collaborators, working from 3 different continents during a pandemic that had locked entire cities down, had actually done it. They had broken the cipher known as Z340, sent by the man calling himself the Zodiac to the San Francisco Chronicle on November 8, 1969. If you've absorbed the popular version of this story, that moment probably sounds like the climax of a decades-long siege against an unbreakable code written by a criminal mastermind too clever for law enforcement, too clever for anyone. The Zodiac as a ghost, a puzzle box with no key, a case that defies explanation. Here's the thing, that framing isn't quite right, and the real story is more interesting than the myth. 2 of the Zodiac's most famous ciphers have in fact been solved, one within about a week, using nothing more than a kitchen table and 2 California school teachers with a knack for puzzles. The other took 51 years and fell not through some flash of insight into the killer's psychology, but because open source software, a small online community, and a few technical realizations about the cipher's construction finally lined up. What remains unsolved isn't really the code. What remains unsolved is the man, and the reasons have far less to do with supernatural cleverness than with the very ordinary, documented limitations of late 1960s policing, fragmented jurisdictions, degraded evidence, and a media environment that turned a regional manhunt into a national myth almost overnight. Over the next while, we're going to walk through this case the way a serious investigator would, rather than the way a viral video does. We'll separate 3 categories the entire time. What's confirmed through physical evidence and verified expert work? What's plausible? A reasonable interpretation serious researchers take seriously but that hasn't been proven? And what's speculation? Sometimes entertaining, often repeated, but unsupported by the record. We'll go through the foundational facts, each major cipher, the major suspect theories, why we solved it claims keep surfacing every year, and end with an honest accounting of what's genuinely still open, because there's quite a bit. With that framework in mind, let's start where the story actually starts. Not with a cipher, not with a nickname. It starts on a gravel turnout off a dark road outside Vallejo, California, on a cold night in December 1968, with 2 teenagers on what was, by every account, a completely unremarkable first date. To understand why this case unfolded the way it did, you have to understand the world it happened in. The late 1960s Bay Area was a strange, charged moment. The summer of love had crested across the bay in Haight-Ashbury in 1967, and by 1968 that cultural energy was curdling in places into something darker. The Manson family was active in Southern California during this same window and would commit the Tate LaBianca murders in August 1969, months after the Zodiac's first confirmed attack. Crime reporting was a major part of how Bay Area newspapers competed, and television news was becoming the dominant way households got information. This matters because the Zodiac case is, from its first week, as much a media story as a criminal one. The killer didn't just commit crimes, he wrote letters to newspapers about them, and the papers, after internal debate, printed those letters. That decision, made by editors at the Chronicle, the Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald in the summer of 1969, shaped everything that came after, including why we're still talking about this more than half a century later. The other piece of context that's easy to forget is how primitive criminal investigation infrastructure was at the time, especially across jurisdictional lines. There was no national DNA database. DNA profiling didn't exist yet as a forensic tool at all, and wouldn't be used in an American courtroom until the mid-1980s. There was no searchable digital fingerprint database connecting departments. Vallejo, Benicia, unincorporated Napa County, and San Francisco each had their own police department or sheriff's office, their own evidence rooms, their own detectives, and no unified system for sharing case files. A killer who moved between these jurisdictions as this one did was exploiting gaps that had nothing to do with cleverness and everything to do with how American law enforcement was structured in 1968 and 1969. Documented operating reality, not speculation, an essential background for why a case with this much physical evidence could still end up unsolved. Now, the timeline. On the night of December 20th, 1968, 17-year-old David Faraday and 16-year-old Betty Lou Jensen drove to a Lover's Lane area on Lake Herman Road outside Vallejo for what family later described as their first date. Both were shot at close range with a .22 caliber handgun. Faraday died at the scene. Jensen was found a short distance away, shot multiple times while apparently trying to run. There was no warning, no apparent struggle, and at the time, no claim of responsibility. For 7 months, this was simply an unsolved double homicide. That changed on July 4th, 1969, less than 2 miles away, near Blue Rock Springs Golf Course. 22-year-old Darlene Farron and Michael Mageau, also 22, were sitting in a parked car when another vehicle pulled up and the driver approached on foot with a flashlight and a handgun, shooting both multiple times. Farron died at the hospital. Mageau survived despite serious wounds and gave police a description that notably varied somewhat from later descriptions given by other surviving witnesses, something we'll return to. Ballistics on shell casings from both the December 1968 and July 1969 scenes showed they'd been fired from the same weapon, one of the earliest pieces of hard, confirmed physical evidence in the case, linking 2 attacks 7 months apart to a single gun. 3.5 weeks later, on July 31st, 1969, 3 Bay Area newspapers, the Chronicle, the Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald, each received a handwritten letter containing 1/3 of a 408-symbol cipher. The letters described non-public details of the Vallejo shootings, which gave them credibility from the start, and demanded each paper print its portion on the front page, or the author would, in his words, go out that weekend and shoot up a number of people. The papers, after consulting police, complied. This is the moment the case stops being a regional crime story and becomes a direct, ongoing public correspondence between an unidentified killer and the press, with the press effectively functioning as his publishing platform. Worth being precise, in this first letter the author hadn't yet called himself the Zodiac. That name first appears in a follow-up letter sent in early August 1969, opening with the now famous line, "This is the Zodiac speaking." From that point on, the name stuck. Within about a week, 2 amateur codebreakers cracked the 408-symbol cipher, and we'll spend real time on exactly how, because it's one of the most well-documented and least mythologized parts of this entire case, and it sets up everything that follows. But first, let's finish the confirmed timeline, because 2 more attacks happened after that first cipher was published. On September 27, 1969, a man in a black hood with a white crossed circle symbol on the chest, the same symbol on the ciphers, approached college students Brian Hartnell, 20, and Cecilia Shepard, 22, at Lake Berryessa in Napa County, claiming to be an escaped convict who needed their car and money. He had Hartnell tie up Shepard and then himself with pre-cut clothesline, then stabbed each of them repeatedly. Shepard died 2 days later. Hartnell survived and gave investigators a detailed account including the killer's appearance and hood symbol. Before leaving, the attacker wrote a brief message directly on Hartnell's car door, the dates of the previous attacks and the same cross-circle symbol. This is one of the few pieces of evidence in the entire case that's unambiguous, physical, and directly tied to the killer's own hand at the actual scene in front of a surviving witness. 2 weeks later, on October 11th, 1969, a cab driver named Paul Stein picked up a fare in downtown San Francisco and drove to Presidio Heights, where he was shot once in the head and killed. The passenger tore a piece of fabric from Stein's blood-stained shirt, took his wallet and keys, and walked off. 3 teenagers nearby saw a man matching a general description leave the scene and called police, but a now well-documented radio dispatch error described the suspect as black when witnesses had described a white man, and patrol officers who encountered a white man on foot near the scene that night didn't stop him, believing he didn't match the description. This is confirmed, documented, and genuinely consequential, acknowledged by the SFPD itself as a serious error, and frequently cited as one of the closest near misses in the case. Days later, the Zodiac sent the Chronicle a letter including the swatch of Stein's shirt as proof. That's the confirmed core. 4 attacks across 3 jurisdictions between December 1968 and October 1969. 5 deaths and 2 survivors, linked to a single offender through ballistics, the recurring crossed circle symbol, handwriting analysis, and non-public crime scene details in the letters. After October 1969, the Zodiac kept sending letters and ciphers for several more years. The most recent confirmed communication most researchers point to is from early 1974, but no further attacks were ever conclusively linked to him with the same level of physical evidence. One more piece of context before the ciphers, because it shapes how the public understands this case. In the years after the attacks, San Francisco Chronicle cartoonist Robert Graysmith became deeply personally invested in the investigation to the point of becoming an amateur researcher in his own right. He eventually published Zodiac in 1986 and Zodiac Unmasked in 2002. These books were enormously influential. They're a major reason the case retained public attention through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and they formed the basis for David Fincher's well-regarded 2007 film, also called Zodiac. Graysmith did real service compiling timelines, letters, and witness accounts in one place for a general audience. But it's important to flag that several specific claims in his books, particularly about his primary suspect Arthur Lee Allen, whom we'll get to, have been disputed or contradicted by other researchers, by law enforcement records, and in some cases by the very investigators Graysmith cited as sources. We're not saying this to dismiss Graysmith's work wholesale. We're saying it because a huge amount of what the public knows about this case actually traces back to these 2 books, and some of that material sits closer to plausible interpretation presented with more confidence than the evidence supported, than to established fact. Keep that distinction in mind as we go through the suspect theories later. So with the confirmed timeline laid out, let's get into the part of this case that most people think of first, the codes. The first cipher, mailed in 3 pieces on July 31st, 1969, now generally called Z408 for its 408 symbols, is in a strange way the least mysterious part of this story, even though it's often presented as the opening move of an unbreakable game. It used a substitution system where each symbol stood for a letter, but not a simple 1 symbol per letter substitution, which basic frequency analysis would crack easily by matching the most common symbols to the most common English letters. Instead, it used homophonic substitution. Several different symbols could represent the same letter. E, the most frequent letter in English, was represented by something like a dozen different symbols, which blunted simple frequency analysis. Even though E was, as always, doing most of the work, The two people credited with solving it were Donald and Betty Hardin, a married couple from Salinas, California, with a shared hobby interest in puzzles and codes. By some accounts, crossword puzzles and cryptograms for years. After the cipher was published in early August 1969, they began working on it at their kitchen table, methodically rather than miraculously. They started from an assumption about content. Given the cipher had been sent by someone who just committed multiple murders to taunt the press and police, they guessed words like I, kill, and killing would appear early, looking for a 4-symbol sequence consistent with kill or killing, and working outward using standard cryptogram solving techniques, testing substitutions, checking for sensible English words, iterating. They had a working solution within about a week. What the decoded message actually said is worth describing accurately, since the content has become part of the case's mythology. Paraphrased, the author described taking pleasure in killing, framed it as hunting, describing humans as, in his view, the most dangerous and rewarding game, more satisfying than hunting animals, and described an afterlife belief in which his victims would become his servants. The message ended with a brief explanation for not revealing his name. Doing so would give people a reason to try to stop him from collecting more slaves for the afterlife. No name, no address, no identifying detail beyond the worldview and motive he chose to share. So here's the confirmed / plausible / speculative line for this first cipher. Confirmed. It was a homophonic substitution cipher solved within about a week by Donald and Betty Hardin using documented conventional cryptanalysis. The solution was accepted by police at the time and independently verified many times since by computer-assisted methods. Plausible but not independently provable. That the motive described, the hunting framework, the afterlife belief, reflects the author's actual psychology rather than a performance crafted for shock value and media attention. Investigators and forensic psychologists have generally treated the stated motive as broadly sincere, given how consistent it remained across years of letters. But consistent across letters and an accurate window into the author's inner life aren't the same claim, and serious researchers tend to hold that distinction even if casual retellings don't. Speculative or unsupported. Any claim that this cipher on its own contains hidden information about identity, location, or future plans beyond what it explicitly says. Despite decades of amateur analysis hunting for secondary hidden messages or codes within the code in Z408, none have held up to scrutiny by professional cryptographers. The second major cipher, Z340, for its 340 symbols, was sent to the Chronicle and published on November 12, 1969, just over a month after the Stein murder. Same visual style. A grid of invented symbols, letters and numbers, clearly from the same author, and for half a century, nothing happened. Professional cryptographers at the FBI and NSA reportedly looked at it, alongside a growing community of amateurs, hobbyists, academics, and enthusiasts who tried every standard technique, frequency analysis, the homophonic approach that worked on Z408, anagram solvers, brute force computer searches as computing power increased through the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. All of it came up empty. By the 2010s, Z340 had a reputation as something close to a cryptographic holy grail. The breakthrough came from an unusual collaboration. David Oranchak, a U.S. software developer, had worked on Z340 for years and built a YouTube channel documenting his progress and failed approaches. In late 2020, Australian applied mathematician Sam Blake, who'd become interested during one of Melbourne's extended COVID lockdowns, began testing a different idea, that the cipher might also involve a transposition, meaning the order of the symbols had been scrambled on top of the substitution, so even a correct substitution table wouldn't produce readable text without also unscrambling the sequence. That turned out to be the key insight. Working with Jorel van Eyck, a Belgian programmer who'd created AZ Decrypt, software particularly good at testing huge numbers of substitution tables and scoring how English-like the result looked. The three combined approaches. Blake used high-performance computing at the University of Melbourne to systematically generate and test millions of candidate transpositions, searching for an arrangement where, once a substitution table was applied, the output started looking like real English. When they found a transposition pattern that, combined with an AZ Decrypt-generated substitution table, produced coherent English for the first time in 51 years, they knew they had it. On December 5, 2020, Oreshak submitted the solution to the FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, which confirmed it was valid, publicly noting the cipher had been solved by private citizens, while also noting the broader Zodiac case remained open and active for their San Francisco field office, and that out of respect for victims and families they wouldn't comment further. In 2024, Oreshak, Blake, and a third co-author published a technical white paper on RxEve detailing the methodology, including the discovery that the cipher's alphabet used 63 distinct symbols, far more than the 26 needed for simple substitution, part of why it had resisted standard approaches for so long. So what did it actually say? Here's where the story takes an almost anticlimactic turn that's itself revealing. The decoded message, paraphrased, was largely a restatement of earlier themes, not being afraid of punishment, including capital punishment, more references to an afterlife where victims would serve him, and a closing line hoping the reader was having as much fun trying to catch him as he'd had committing the attacks. No name, no address, no map coordinates, no independently verifiable confession of additional crimes. Multiple outlets covering the solution describe the content as somewhat dull relative to 51 years of buildup, itself an important data point. The cipher wasn't a locked vault containing the killer's identity. It was a very well-constructed puzzle whose content turned out to be consistent with, but not dramatically beyond, what the letters had already said. It's worth pausing on the scale of the initial reaction, because the gap between that reaction and the actual content is itself part of this story. Within hours of the FBI's confirmation, the news had spread to outlets across North America, Europe, Australia, and beyond, moving through wire services, television broadcasts, and an enormous wave of social media activity, concentrated in the online cipher and true crime communities that had quietly worked on Z340 for years. For a brief window, Zodiac Cipher Solved was one of the most shared crime stories online worldwide, and a lot of that initial coverage leaned on the language this case always attracts. 51 years finally cracked, the killer's code broken at last. That framing wasn't inaccurate exactly, but it primed audiences to expect that cracking the code and revealing the killer's identity were effectively the same unlock. When the decoded text turned out to be a few hundred characters of restated bravado, the correction, solved, but it doesn't tell us who he was, never spread with anywhere near the velocity of the original announcement, and plenty of people today still believe in good faith that the 2020 solution named, or nearly named, a suspect. On Halloween night, October 31st, 1966, more than 2 years before Lake Herman Road, 18-year-old community college student Sherry Jo Bates was murdered on the campus of Riverside City College, several hundred miles south of the Bay Area. She'd been stabbed multiple times near her car, which had apparently been disabled. Investigators later found ignition wires pulled loose, possibly to strand her. About a month later, anonymous letters went to local police and a newspaper, written in a disjointed, taunting style with crime details. A few months after that, a poem referencing the murder was reportedly found carved into a desk at the college. The connection to the Zodiac comes from similarities investigators noticed between these letters and the Zodiac's later correspondence. A similarly taunting tone, similar handwriting characteristics according to some examiners, and a similar pattern of writing to both police and press. For a period, some investigators, including reportedly some FBI analysts, considered Bates a plausible early Zodiac crime, predating the Bay Area attacks by 2 years. This gained renewed attention in 2021, central to a story we'll get to shortly. But here's where the confirmed versus plausible versus speculative framework earns its keep. When investigators suspect two crimes share an offender but lack direct forensic links, no shared DNA, no matched prints, they often rely on linkage analysis, comparing behavioral details like approach, restraints, and communications for a combination distinctive enough to be unlikely as coincidence. It's a legitimate technique, but probabilistic, not definitive. And the further apart two crimes are in time and geography, the more that gap matters when there's no corroborating physical evidence. The handwriting comparisons between the Bates letters and confirmed Zodiac letters remain a point of genuine disagreement among document examiners. Some find them consistent, others find meaningful differences. Riverside is roughly 8 to 9 hours from the Vallejo and San Francisco locations, and the gap between Bates and Lake Herman Road is just over 2 years, with nothing linking them in between. Some of the most dedicated long-term researchers, including Tom Voigt, who has run one of the largest Zodiac archives online for years, have expressed real doubt about the connection. So where does that leave us? Genuinely contested, not confirmed, not debunked. A real disagreement among people who've looked closely at the evidence. This is also one of the more interesting, plausible but unproven interpretations in the case. In interviews, Oranchuk suggested the Zodiac himself might not have intended Z340 to be quite this difficult. The combination of an unusually large symbol set and a transposition pattern may have made it far harder to break than its author anticipated. The computational analysis that eventually cracked it, running millions of candidate transpositions on university computing clusters, simply didn't exist as a concept in 1969. Under this interpretation, Z340's 51-year resistance wasn't a triumph of criminal genius outpacing law enforcement. It may have been closer to an accident of construction, invulnerable to 20th century cryptanalysis, but not to 21st century crowdsourced computation. That's a meaningfully different story than the killer designed an unbreakable code, and it's better supported by the documented technical details. Let's be precise about confirmed versus speculative here too, since this is one of the most frequently misrepresented parts of the case online. Confirmed, Z340 was a combined homophonic substitution and transposition cipher, solved December 5, 2020 by Oranchak, Blake, and Van Eyck, independently verified by the FBI, with content consistent with themes from earlier decoded letters. Plausible but not certain. That its extreme difficulty was an unintended byproduct of construction rather than a deliberate attempt at unbreakable. Flatly unsupported, despite how often you'll see it claimed, that the solved Z340 contains, in any form, a name, address, map, or anything that meaningfully advances identification. It doesn't. Anyone telling you the 2020 solution basically solved the case is working from a misunderstanding of what was actually decoded. Now, if you're keeping score, that's two major ciphers, one solved almost immediately in 1969, one solved in 2020 after half a century. But the Zodiac sent more than two coded messages, and at least one remains genuinely, unambiguously unsolved to this day. Its story tells us something important about how the mythology around the 37 victims got built in the first place. In April 1970, the Zodiac mailed a greeting card to the Chronicle containing a 13-character cipher, now called Z13, with an accompanying letter claiming it contained his name. As of this recording, Z13 has never been solved. Not by the team that cracked Z340, not by any of the dozens of professional and amateur cryptographers who've tried since. There are honest reasons for this, none requiring conspiracy. 13 characters is far too little data for the statistical, frequency-based approaches that worked on the much longer Z408 and Z340. Those methods need enough text for patterns to emerge. It's entirely possible Z13 uses an internally consistent substitution scheme that, with so little material, can be distinguished from other equally plausible schemes, meaning there may be more than one solution that produces readable text. with no way to tell which the author intended. There's also the open possibility, taken seriously by some researchers, that the claim itself that this cipher contains his name was never true, just another piece of the press performance. This brings us to a claim you'll encounter in almost every piece of casual content about this case, stated as flatly as the confirmed body count, that the Zodiac killed 37 people. Across his letters, the author made escalating claims about his total victims, eventually landing on 37, a claim made by the offender himself, in correspondence whose explicit purpose was to generate fear and media attention. Investigators and serious researchers have generally treated this with significant skepticism, for a simple reason. Of the attacks tied to a single offender through ballistics, physical evidence, the crossed circle symbol, and consistent handwriting, the total is 7 victims across 4 incidents, 5 deaths and 2 survivors, all within a roughly 10-month window in 1968 and 1969. There's a meaningful difference between the number of attacks supported by forensic linkage and the number an unidentified person claimed in letters whose entire purpose was to maximize impact, and conflating the two is one of the most common, consequential distortions in how this case gets discussed. So if the confirmed body count is 7 and the claimed count is 37, what about the gap in between? Are there other attacks elsewhere that might genuinely belong to the same person? Cases where the connection is plausible but not proven? That question takes us into some of the most contested territory in the entire case. As for the typed correspondence, one later letter, from the early to mid-1970s, references the film The Exorcist by name, and because of its content, timing, and some noted differences from earlier letters, a number of researchers treat it with real skepticism as a possible hoax by someone other than the original author. A good example of the broader hoax letter question we'll return to. Typewriter searches were a standard step when investigators developed a person of interest, reportedly including, for the suspect we're about to discuss, checks of typewriters at his workplaces. As with the handwriting comparisons, none of these searches produced a confirmed match. The single most prominent named suspect in the Zodiac case, the only person the SFPD has ever publicly identified as a suspect in any official capacity, was a man named Arthur Lee Allen. Allen first came to police attention in 1971 when his former brother-in-law, a man named Don Chaney, told investigators about conversations he'd had with Allen years earlier, in which Allen had allegedly talked in disturbing detail about wanting to commit murders, had expressed admiration for a pulp adventure story called The Most Dangerous Game, about a hunter who stalks human prey, a theme that, if you'll recall, echoes almost word for word the framing in the decoded Z408 cipher, and had allegedly used the name Zodiac in conversation before it had become publicly associated with the case. Allen was a Vallejo area resident, a former elementary school teacher who had lost his teaching position, and he had a documented criminal history that included a 1974 conviction for child molestation. He had also, by some accounts, been acquainted with Darlene Ferrin, one of the victims of the July 1969 attack, though the nature and closeness of that acquaintance has been described differently by different sources. SFPD inspectors Dave Toshi and Bill Armstrong, among the lead investigators through the 1970s, pursued Allen as their primary suspect for years. In 1991, investigators searched his home and a trailer, recovering knives, weapons, ammunition, and a typewriter, but nothing constituting a confirmed physical match to known Zodiac evidence. Allen was never charged. He died in 1992 of complications related to diabetes. Graysmith's books, particularly Zodiac Unmasked, built an extensive circumstantial case around Allen, and for a generation of readers and viewers of the 2007 film, Allen became essentially synonymous with the Zodiac, to the point many casual followers assume his identification was definitively confirmed. It was not. In 2002, a development occurred that, depending on how you frame it, either complicated or clarified the picture. A second case frequently folded into the Zodiac narrative is the disappearance of Donna Lass, a nurse working near South Lake Tahoe, who vanished in September 1970 and was never found. Her case remains, formally, a missing persons case rather than a confirmed homicide. The connection comes from a postcard sent to the Chronicle roughly 6 months later, which some investigators read as containing references to the South Lake Tahoe area, a possible taunting hint about her fate. This is a connection some investigators have taken seriously, but it's never moved beyond an interpreted hint in a postcard. No physical evidence, no body, no confirmed cause of death, no forensic link beyond a postcard whose meaning is itself a matter of interpretation. If you've seen Donna Lass presented as a confirmed Zodiac victim, that overstates things. If you've seen it presented as obviously connected, he basically told us, that overstates things in the other direction too. The accurate framing, a 1970 missing persons case that some investigators, based on one ambiguous piece of correspondence, considered a possible connection, and that's where it's remained for over 50 years. What both of these cases illustrate, and what's worth sitting with for a moment, is how the Zodiac's own letter-writing habit created an almost self-perpetuating engine for new connections. Because the actual author wrote to the press repeatedly, claiming credit, making references, and dropping hints, some of which were verifiably true and some of which were never substantiated. Every subsequent unsolved violent crime or disappearance in California from that era became a candidate for maybe this was him too, especially if any piece of correspondence, however ambiguous, could be read as referencing it. This is a structural feature of the case, not a flaw in any individual researcher's reasoning. When an offender actively wants to be connected to things, separating real connections from claimed ones becomes extraordinarily difficult, and that difficulty doesn't go away just because more time passes. If anything, it compounds. Each new generation of researchers inherits not just the original evidence, but also decades of accumulated, maybe connected cases layered on top of it, with no clean way to tell which of those layers, if any, the original author actually intended. So, we've covered the confirmed attacks, the 2 solved ciphers, the 1 unsolved cipher, the gap between confirmed and claimed victims, and the 2 most prominent, maybe connected cases, all in a sense about the crimes and communications. Now we get to the question that drives most public fascination. Who was he? And here, more than anywhere else, the gap between what's been claimed and what's been established is enormous. Before getting to any specific name, it helps to understand the 2 forensic tools investigators actually had for comparing a suspect against the correspondence, because almost every suspect theory eventually runs into one or both of these and stalls there. Some of the Zodiac correspondence, including the letters accompanying the 2 ciphers, was handwritten in a distinctive all-capital block printing style. Other pieces, especially later ones, were typewritten. That gave investigators 2 established disciplines: question document examination, comparing handwriting, and typewriter identification, comparing the mechanical quirks of a specific machine. According to accounts from the period, the letters were reviewed by California's State Department of Justice Documents section, with the examiner most often associated with the case in contemporaneous reporting being Sherwood Morrill, the state's chief document examiner. Over the years, handwriting samples were collected from many suspects, sometimes formally, sometimes from documents like job applications, and compared against the confirmed letters. For the most prominent suspects, including the one we're about to discuss, results consistently came back as no confirmed match rather than a clean exclusion or identification, the same shape of result that came up with the 2002 DNA testing, and a pattern that repeats across nearly every major suspect theory in this case. That phrase does a lot of work. A document examiner comparing handwriting isn't running a test with a numerical output the way a DNA lab is. They're weighing dozens of characteristics like letter formation, spacing, slant, and pressure, and a result of insufficient similarities to confirm, insufficient differences to exclude, is an honest description of what the discipline can tell you, especially across samples written years or decades apart. The Zodiac's own printing style wasn't perfectly uniform letter to letter, and some examiners and researchers have read that variation as evidence the author could vary his own hand, whether deliberately to frustrate comparison or just naturally. Either way, it means any single suspect sample is being measured against a moving target. It's also worth noting that handwriting analysis as a forensic science has faced real scrutiny since a 2009 National Academy of Sciences report raised concerns about several pattern comparison disciplines, including questioned document examination, for relying heavily on subjective judgment with limited validated error rates. That doesn't make handwriting comparison worthless, but it means a no-confirmed match from the 1970s carries less weight by modern standards than true crime media often implies. And Allen, despite being the only suspect ever named publicly by the SFPD, is far from the only name put forward over the decades. In fact, the sheer volume of competing theories, and how often new ones make headlines, is itself one of the most revealing things about how this case has been covered. By 2009, the SFPD had reportedly investigated something on the order of 2,500 different suspects. By 2022, a researcher running one of the longest-standing Zodiac archive sites estimated that 50 to 100 new suspects get named publicly every year, not cumulatively. That alone tells you something. It's not that no one has theories, it's that there are functionally too many. The overwhelming majority built on circumstantial resemblance, someone who lived in the right area, whose handwriting looks vaguely similar in a low-resolution scan, whose family member made an offhand deathbed comment reinterpreted decades later. The theory generating the most mainstream attention in the 21st century arrived in spring 2021 when a group called the Casebreakers, led by writer and producer Thomas J. Colbert, announced they'd identified the Zodiac as Gary Francis Post, a house painter who died in 2018 at 80. The announcement was extensively covered, with claims that Posty's appearance matched composite sketches, that aspects of his background in military service aligned with phrasings in the letters, and, notably, that Posty was also responsible for the 1966 Cherry Joe Bates murder, explicitly tying this theory to the older Bates connection. The group also claimed associates of Posty described him giving away a large personal arsenal of firearms and ammunition components before his death, which they framed as potentially significant evidence sitting untouched in private homes. The response from law enforcement was immediate and instructive about how these announcements typically play out. The FBI's San Francisco field office confirmed the case remained open and said they had no new information to report. Neutral, neither endorsing nor specifically rebutting the claim, but declining to treat it as resolution. Riverside investigator Ryan Railsback, involved in the still-open Bates case, was more directly skeptical, calling the evidence largely circumstantial. As of this recording, no agency has confirmed the Posty identification. No charges have been filed, largely symbolic anyway, since Posty was already dead, and the case remains formally open and unsolved according to every agency with jurisdiction. This pattern: a private researcher announces a definitive identification, gets substantial coverage, and law enforcement responds with some version of "the case remains open, nothing further to add," has repeated multiple times with multiple suspects, and a couple of other prominent examples illustrate slightly different versions of the same issue. In 2014, Gary the 50th, Stewart published The Most Dangerous Animal of All, arguing, based on research into his own birth records, that his biological father, Earl Van Best Jr., who died in 1984, was the Zodiac. Stewart, given up for adoption as an infant, became convinced that visual similarities between his father and police sketches, plus details of his father's life including a 1962 marriage to a teenage girl that had made local news, added up to a compelling case. The book got considerable attention and was for a period treated as a potential breakthrough, but subsequent independent reporting and DNA analysis of the Van Best/Stewart family line against Zodiac evidence didn't produce a confirming match, and several researchers who'd initially found the case compelling later walked back their support. A good example of a theory that started from genuine personal investigation, gained real traction, and gradually lost support under scrutiny without ever being formally closed out, because that's not how these things tend to resolve. Another name that's circulated for years is Richard Gaikowski, who worked for a Bay Area underground newspaper and later in public broadcasting. The theory gained traction in the early 2000s, partly from a woman who said she recognized his voice from a televised excerpt of a call attributed to the Zodiac, partly from his Bay Area presence during the relevant period, and claimed handwriting similarities. As with the others, it has supporters among independent researchers, has never been confirmed by law enforcement, and faces counter-arguments, including questions about Gaikowski's whereabouts during at least one confirmed attack. And then there's the most recent example, still playing out as this is recorded. In April 2025, Zodiac, Tokens, The Final Cipher, was published by an author identified as a retired FBI profiler, claiming to draw on previously unreleased files and new interviews. Around the same time, a documentary that premiered at South by Southwest 2025 brought another wave of attention, new tips, and fresh online speculation. As of this recording, no agency has announced any official breakthrough connected to either project, and the case remains, formally, open. If you've noticed a pattern across Allen, Posty, Van Best, Gaikowski, and whatever name is trending this year, here it is, stated plainly. In roughly 55 years, across thousands of investigated suspects and dozens of high-profile identifications, there's exactly one suspect a relevant police department has ever named officially: Arthur Lee Allen. And even that never resulted in charges or a definitive forensic resolution. Every other name, no matter how confident the headline or thumbnail, represents a private theory law enforcement has, at most, acknowledged receiving and declined to confirm, which raises an obvious question. If the evidence is this consistently inconclusive, why does this case generate "we solved it" headlines almost every year? Before answering directly, there's one more widely repeated claim worth pulling apart. It sits at the heart of the pattern recognition problem we're about to discuss, and it's quite possibly the very first thing most people learn about this case: the name itself. Here's the claim as most people encounter it. The Zodiac chose his name and symbol, and possibly even the timing of his attacks, because he saw himself operating within a genuine astrological or occult framework. The crossed circle is an ancient astrological glyph. The name reflects a real belief system, and the attack dates cluster suspiciously close to the solstices and equinoxes, as if each marked a turning point of the zodiacal year. Let's take this apart piece by piece, because it's a good case study in how a claim can contain a real, verifiable kernel wrapped in a much larger layer of inference that doesn't hold up. What's solidly true? The author did adopt the name Zodiac, first appearing in correspondence in early August 1969. He did use a consistent symbol, a circle divided by a cross, resembling rifle scope crosshairs across his letters, and in at least one documented instance, produced it at an actual crime scene, on Hartnell's car door at Lake Berryessa, in front of a surviving witness. Both confirmed and undisputed. The second factor is more recent, and it's about the specific economics of how content about cases like this gets distributed today. Recommendation algorithms on platforms like YouTube and TikTok are optimized for engagement, watch time, clicks, comments, shares. And there's a deep, well-documented asymmetry in how engaging confident claims are compared to hedged accurate ones. A video titled "We Finally Know Who the Zodiac Killer Was" will, on average, dramatically outperform one titled "Here's What We Actually Know and Don't Know," with appropriate caveats, even if the second is far more accurate. This isn't a moral failing on any individual creator's part so much as a structural incentive. The platforms reward certainty and novelty regardless of whether it's warranted. Over years and thousands of pieces of content, this creates an information environment where the confident, simplified version, The case was basically solved in 2020. Allen was definitely cleared by DNA. 37 is the real number. Gets amplified far more than the accurate, messier version, simply because the messier version doesn't perform as well, regardless of its truth value. The third factor is institutional distrust, and here that distrust has at least some basis in documented institutional failure. Part of what makes it so effective at making fringe explanations feel plausible. We talked about the radio dispatch error after the Stein murder, where officers given an inaccurate description may have encountered the actual attacker without realizing it, an acknowledged error, not a rumor. We talked about the genuinely fragmented multi-jurisdictional investigation at a time when sharing information between agencies was slow and informal. The Vallejo Police Department reportedly placed its portion of the case into inactive status in the mid-2000s, citing resource constraints easy from the outside to read as the police gave up. Combine a documented track record of communication failures and resource-driven inactivity with a string of "the case remains open, no further comment" statements every time a new theory makes headlines, and you create fertile ground for the idea that official channels either can't or won't solve this, and that real answers are more likely to come from independent researchers or people the establishment doesn't want you to listen to. That doesn't require any actual conspiracy, just enough genuine institutional friction stretched across enough decades to make "the official story is incomplete" feel like common sense. Now, the symbol itself. A circle divided by a cross is an old design appearing across astronomy, astrology, alchemy, and other traditions, as the earth, the four cardinal directions, completeness. So in the loose sense that this shape appears in astrological contexts, the claim isn't wrong. But here's what tends to get left out. At the time, that same design was also the commercial logo of a Swiss watch manufacturer, Zodiac, which had been selling watches in the US for years. A number of researchers point out that someone saw this logo on a watch or in an ad and adopted both name and symbol because they sounded and looked mysterious, is at least as plausible as this reflects a genuine occult cosmology. Arguably more so, since it requires inferring far less about the author's inner life. Neither explanation has been confirmed. The author never explained either choice. But when one explanation requires constructing an entire private belief system from scratch, and the other just requires someone to have seen a watch, that asymmetry is worth sitting with. Then there's the dates, where the theory falls apart fastest once checked against a calendar. The four confirmed attacks: December 20th, 1968, July 4th, 1969, September 27th, 1969, and October 11th, 1969. The solstices and equinoxes fall within a day or two of December 21st, June 21st, March 20th, and September 22nd or 23rd. Of the four attack dates, exactly one lines up closely. December 20th sits within a day of the winter solstice. The other three don't. July 4th is roughly 2 weeks after the summer solstice. September 27th is 4 to 5 days after the autumn equinox, and October 11th isn't near any solstice or equinox at all. So out of 4 data points, one is a close match and the other 3 range from a few days off to not close at all. Exactly the kind of result apophenia thrives on. Foreground the data point that fits, ignore or rationalize the rest. With only 4 attacks and a flexible enough framework, you could construct an equally confident narrative around almost any recurring calendrical theme. The theory isn't disprovable in some absolute sense, because with this little data, almost nothing is. But it isn't supported either, and isn't supported, but can't be definitively ruled out, is very different from "the dates were astrologically significant," which is how this idea usually gets presented. So, to draw the line cleanly, confirmed. The name Zodiac and the crossed circle symbol were used consistently from August 1969 onward, including at one crime scene. Plausible, though unconfirmed, that name and symbol were borrowed from an existing commercial source, a watch brand using the same design, requiring far fewer assumptions than an occult belief explanation. Unimportant that the attack timing followed any consistent astrological or occult calendar, checked against the actual dates. The pattern isn't there beyond one coincidental alignment. There's a fourth, more subtle factor specific to this case. 2 of the ciphers actually were solved, one quickly, one after a very long time, but both through legitimate, verifiable means. That creates an implicit promise. If the codes were solvable, doesn't that mean the identity is solvable too, given enough effort or the right insight? But this conflates 2 different problems. Solving a cipher is about information that already exists, complete, waiting for the right key. Identifying a person who deliberately concealed their identity, who may be deceased, whose evidence has degraded over 50+ years, and for whom no definitive comparison sample may exist, is fundamentally different. The answer might not be recoverable from the available evidence at all, no matter how clever anyone is. The 2020 solution is one of the great recent achievements in applied cryptanalysis. It was never going to be a Rosetta Stone for the killer's identity, but because it happened, it subtly recharged the broader expectation that the big answer must be just as achievable. So that's the engine. Pattern-seeking minds presented with genuinely symbol-rich material, an information ecosystem that rewards confidence over accuracy, a documented history of institutional friction that makes distrust feel earned, and a partial track record of real solutions implying more is solvable than actually is. Put those together over 55 years and you get this exact landscape. A case where some of the most repeated facts are unverified claims, where the most confident theories are the least confirmed, and where the genuinely solved parts get less attention than the parts that remain open. Which brings us to an honest accounting of what those open parts actually are. Before moving to open questions, there's one more piece of the documented record worth sitting with, because it sits right at the intersection of established fact and how seriously do we take this person's stated capabilities, and it often gets left out of shorter retellings. In the years following the confirmed attacks, the Zodiac sent several letters going beyond taunts and threats of further shootings, including what was presented as a design for an explosive device intended for a school bus, with a plan to detonate it on a route and a hand-drawn diagram. Authorities at the time didn't treat this as an empty boast. Bomb disposal and law enforcement personnel reviewed the materials, and, without getting into any specifics about the design itself, assessments varied. Some considered it to reflect genuine technical familiarity, others considered aspects impractical, or more consistent with something that looked sophisticated on paper, without necessarily being fully functional. Out of caution, school districts in the affected area increased bus route security for a period. What's confirmed here is narrow but real. The letters and diagram exist, are part of the documented case file, and were taken seriously enough to prompt actual precautionary measures, a useful corrective to any framing of the Zodiac as just a letter writer whose threats were all talk. What's genuinely unresolved is whether the threat represented a real operational capability, or was, like much else in this case, theater calibrated for effect rather than execution. No bombing attributed to the Zodiac was ever carried out, which some take as evidence the threat was never operational, and others take as evidence increased security made him reconsider. There's no way from the available record to determine which is closer to the truth. A documented fact sitting right next to a genuinely unanswerable question about what it meant. Exactly the kind of layered uncertainty we want to spend our final stretch on properly. So let's take stock, honestly, of what remains genuinely open. Not open in the sense of law enforcement hasn't told us yet, but open in the sense that serious researchers who spend decades on this material still disagree, or simply don't know, even after everything we've covered. The first and most obvious is Z13, the 13-character cipher from April 1970 that the author claimed contained his name. It remains unsolved. Unlike Z340, where the breakthrough came from realizing the cipher combined two known techniques unusually, Z13 doesn't have an obvious structural insight waiting to be found. Its problem is fundamentally insufficient data. Cryptographers who've looked at it, including some involved in solving Z340, have generally been candid that 13 characters may simply not contain enough information for a unique, verifiable solution. Even if the underlying scheme is eventually understood, Z13 could be solved multiple times by different people, each producing a different readable result, with no way to determine which represents what the author intended. A strange kind of unsolved. Not we haven't found the answer, but potentially there may be no way to ever be confident we have, even if we have. The second, and the big one, is identity. As of this recording, no individual has been identified as the Zodiac through physical evidence to a standard any law enforcement agency with jurisdiction has confirmed, despite the existence of physical evidence. A partial DNA profile from the 1969 stamp, fingerprints recovered from various pieces of correspondence and from the crime scenes themselves, and handwriting from numerous letters that document examiners have analyzed extensively over the decades. The problem isn't an absence of evidence, it's that what exists is in various ways degraded, partial, ambiguous, or simply not matched to anyone whose comparison sample has been tested against it. Whether that will ever change is genuinely unknown. Other long cold cases have been solved in recent years through a technique called forensic genetic genealogy, most famously the 2018 identification of the so-called Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, more than 4 decades after his crimes, using a crime scene DNA profile uploaded to consumer genealogy databases to identify distant relatives and work inward toward a specific individual. Whether a similar approach could ever work for the Zodiac case depends entirely on whether a sufficiently clean, single-source DNA profile exists anywhere in the surviving evidence, and as far as public reporting indicates, that remains an open technical question that hasn't been definitively answered either way. The honest answer is maybe, if the evidence allows it, and we don't currently know if it does, which is considerably less satisfying than either yes, any day now, or no, never, and considerably more accurate than either. A third open question, related to identity but distinct, is whether every piece of correspondence attributed to the Zodiac actually came from the same person. This is a genuinely live debate among serious researchers that gets far less attention than Suspect of the Year headlines, partly because some letters might be hoaxes by different people, is a less dramatic story than We Found Him. The confirmed attacks span roughly 10 months in 1968 and 1969, but the correspondence continued, with varying confidence in its authenticity, into the early 1970s. Handwriting analysis across that span hasn't produced uniform conclusions. Some later letters have been flagged as showing meaningful differences from the earlier, more confidently authenticated ones, raising the possibility that some later letters were hoaxes, written by people who, watching this become a national phenomenon, wanted in, whether for attention, to mislead investigators, or as a dark joke taken seriously. If true even for some later correspondence, details people treat as part of the Zodiac's pattern, potentially including claims feeding the Donna Lass connection, might be artifacts of a copycat layered onto the genuine case in a way that's now very difficult to untangle. Fourth, the current formal status of the investigation is more fragmented than people assume, and that fragmentation is part of the unresolved picture too. The attacks fall under multiple agencies: Vallejo PD for Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs, Napa County Sheriff's Office for Lake Berryessa, SFPD for the Stein murder, plus the FBI. Given the interstate nature of some correspondence and threats, each has at different points described the case in slightly different terms: open but inactive, open and under periodic review, and there's no single unified status the way true crime media often implies. When the FBI says, as it did in 2020 and 2021, that the investigation remains open, that's accurate, but it doesn't mean an active task force is working it daily. It means no agency has formally closed it, and any credible new evidence, a DNA match, a confession, a verified document, would be reviewed by whichever agency has jurisdiction over that piece of the case. Whether open in that sense differs meaningfully from closed in practice is itself something reasonable people disagree about, and it's part of why new suspect announcements tend to generate the same noncommittal response from agency after agency, year after year. And finally, there's Cherry Joe Bates and Donna Lass. Exactly where we left them. Genuinely contested, not resolved by anything since, including the 2021 Casebreakers claims, which, whatever else they did, didn't produce evidence settling either question for the broader research community. Before bringing this all together, it's worth zooming out for a moment, because there's a dimension of this case that gets crowded out when the conversation is dominated by ciphers and suspects, and that's the human one. And it's also part of why this case became the template it did for an entire genre of media that didn't really exist in its current form before this. David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen were teenagers on a first date, the kind of evening that for almost anyone else would simply be a forgettable early chapter in growing up. Darlene Farron was 22, with a young child who grew up without her. Cecilia Shepard was a college student studying to become a teacher. Brian Hartnell, who survived Lake Berryessa, carried the physical and psychological aftermath for the rest of his life and remained, for decades, one of the few living people who'd seen the attacker up close and could speak about it directly. His account, given in interviews over the years, remained a touchstone for investigators precisely because eyewitness testimony from a confirmed encounter is so rare in this case. Paul Stein was a cab driver working a normal Saturday night shift, doing the kind of routine job that thousands of people in the city were doing that same evening. Michael Mageau, who survived the July 1969 shooting, lived with the knowledge he'd been targeted essentially at random, for no reason connected to anything about him personally. One of the more genuinely unsettling aspects of the entire case, easy to lose sight of underneath the puzzle box framing. These were real people, with families who spent the rest of their lives in a kind of permanent limbo, not the closure of a conviction, not the finality of an explanation, just an open file and, periodically, a new headline claiming someone had finally found the answer, followed, just as periodically, by that headline quietly fading without confirmation. It's also worth situating this case within the broader arc of how American culture came to talk about this category of crime at all. The phrase serial killer is often credited in popular accounts to FBI agent Robert Ressler, who by some tellings began using it in the late 1970s, around the same period cases like Ted Bundy's were also receiving massive national attention not long after the core Zodiac attacks themselves. Some researchers note versions of the concept existed earlier, but there's broad agreement the late 1970s and early 1980s were when this became a mainstream framework, and the Zodiac case, with its ongoing media presence throughout that exact period, was part of the cultural backdrop against which that framework took shape. The case also had a direct cultural echo. The 1971 film Dirty Harry featured a villain known as the Scorpio Killer. Widely understood at the time, including by some of the filmmaker's own comments, to be inspired by the still unfolding, still unsolved Zodiac case in the very city where the film was set and shot. A Hollywood film referencing an active, unsolved case as inspiration for its antagonist, while the actual case was still generating new letters. An early, vivid example of the line between real unsolved crime and entertainment product, blurring in exactly the way that decades later would become the normal operating mode of an entire true crime media ecosystem. That ecosystem today includes something the original investigators in 1969 could never have anticipated: a sustained, decentralized, often quite technically serious amateur research community. The same online spaces that produce the apophenia-driven theories, the Radian maps, the suspect of the year announcements, also produce the actual solution to Z340, Oranchak's YouTube channel, the open source AZ Decrypt software, online forums where people compared notes on cipher attempts for years. This is genuinely a case where amateur doesn't mean unserious. Some of the most rigorous work on this case, formally validated by the FBI, has come from people working outside any official institution in their spare time for free, sustained by nothing but genuine interest. That cuts against any simple narrative framing official investigators and internet sleuths as cleanly opposed. Both categories contain serious work and speculation that outran the evidence, and Z340's solution is proof the messy, decentralized, internet-era version of this case isn't purely a story of misinformation. Sometimes it's also where the real answers come from. So, where does all of this leave us? Here's what's settled as anything in this case gets. Between December 1968 and October 1969, a single individual committed a series of attacks across 3 Bay Area jurisdictions, killing 5 people and wounding 2 others, linked through physical evidence, ballistics, a marking made at one of the crime scenes, and consistent handwriting across an extensive paper trail of letters sent directly to the press. That individual gave himself the name Zodiac beginning in August 1969, used the correspondence to claim responsibility, issue threats, including a bus bombing threat authorities took seriously enough to act on, and send a series of encoded messages. Of those, the 408-character cipher was solved within about a week by Donald and Betty Hardin using straightforward documented cryptanalysis. And the far more complex 340-character cipher was solved 51 years later, in December 2020, by David Orenchak, Sam Blake, and Jarl Van Eyck, independently verified by the FBI. Neither solved cipher contained a name or identifying information. A single suspect, Arthur Lee Allen, was investigated extensively by the SFPD for roughly 2 decades and never charged, with a 2002 DNA test on degraded evidence neither confirming nor reliably excluding him. And the case remains, formally, open across multiple jurisdictions, more than 55 years after it began. And here's what's genuinely, honestly still open, with no spin in either direction. The 13-character cipher from April 1970 remains unsolved, and may be unsolvable in any verifiable sense given how little data it contains. The author's true identity remains unknown, and whether existing physical evidence could ever support a conclusive identification through DNA, forensic genetic genealogy, or any other method is itself an unanswered technical question. Whether every piece of correspondence attributed to the Zodiac actually came from one person, or whether the record includes one or more hoaxes layered on top of the genuine case, is a live, unresolved debate among people who've spent their careers on this material. And the connections to the 1966 Cherry Joe Bates murder and the 1970 disappearance of Donna Lass remain exactly what they've been for decades: plausible to some careful researchers, unconvincing to others, and unconfirmed by anyone with the authority to confirm them. What strikes me most, having gone through all of this, is how that December 2020 email, the one we opened with, actually fits into the larger picture. It wasn't an ending. It was, in its own way, a kind of demonstration, proof that this case is not and never was a monument to some unsolvable, almost supernatural cleverness. It's a case made of very solvable pieces: a substitution cipher cracked at a kitchen table, a transposition pattern cracked on a university supercomputer during a pandemic lockdown, sitting right alongside pieces that may genuinely never be solvable, not because the person behind them was too smart, but because of the much more ordinary, much less satisfying realities of degraded evidence, fragmented jurisdictions, the passage of more than half a century, and possibly more than one hand involved in writing the later letters. The myth wants this to be a single unified puzzle with a single elegant key, because that's a story with a satisfying shape. Find the key, turn it once, and everything else falls into place. The documented reality is messier and honestly more interesting than that. A patchwork where some pieces have already been solved using nothing more exotic than patience and a kitchen table. Others required a global pandemic and a university supercomputer, and others may simply be permanently out of reach, not because no one has tried hard enough, but because the evidence itself may no longer be capable of giving up an answer. Parts solved, parts genuinely open, and parts where we may never even have the tools to know the difference between the two. Maybe that's the most honest place to leave it. Somewhere in California, more than 55 years ago, a person committed a small number of murders, wrote about them for years afterward, and then, at some point, simply stopped, and the silence that followed has been filled, ever since, by exactly the kind of pattern-finding, story-building, and certainty-seeking that the original letters seemed almost designed to provoke. The cipher that took 51 years to break didn't end that. If anything, it just proved how much of this story was never really about the code at all.